Thank you so much. And it's really nice to see some of the people that I recognize from yesterday. So that's really terrific, too. And I was telling Rhonda that one of the things that I remember when I was first introduced to gifted education, I was introduced to gifted education by the San Diego Unified School District. And that was the work that was being done at the time by, I believe his name was Dave Hermanson, and it was well touted across the state that this was the place to really look at if you wanted to model for gifted education. So I have great memories of being I think a second-year teacher and tripping down to San Diego to look and see what was happening in classrooms. Today I'm really going to look at something that I have felt very fervently about but really haven't spoken about before in the way that I'm going to be speaking about it today. So I really will be interested in knowing, what it is that you perceive is important in what I have to say and how it may have some relationship to the kinds of experiences that you have in teaching gifted students or in teaching all students. But what we're really going to focus in on is the nature of differentiation and its implications for diversity. And what we're going to do is look at typical diversity, the kind that you and I address all the time. The students who are academically diverse, even though they might be gifted, kids who have different potential in different areas. We're going to talk, obviously, about linguistic diversity, students who speak more than one language or are learning English. We're going to talk about, obviously, cultural and economic diversity, but I also want to show you some really interesting aspects of diversity that we don't talk a lot about. And so I'm going to leave that as the pages get turned and see, again, to answer the question, what do we do about diversity among gifted learners? And how do we differentiate for the diversity, not just between gifted and their non-gifted peers, but between gifted kids who have different areas of need, be it academic or social, be it something that comes from culture or something that comes from some physiological kind of structure. So with that, your job is to ask questions or bring up other points of view anywhere along the way. And my job is to introduce you to some of the basics of gifted education as it relates to differentiation, and then see what we can do to look at those in terms of diversity. So in the archives of gifted education, we talk about acceleration, we talk about depth, complexity, and novelty. And just a really short kind of story about this. I was fortunate enough to be involved in 1994, which sounds like 1,000 years ago, but in actuality was not that long ago, when the California Department of Education received a grant from the federal government to ask and answer the question, what should a state really do to promote gifted education in a curricular sense? Because, in that time we still had laws that talked about identification, and we had something in the archives of those laws that talked about the idea of differentiation, but it was still really not clear. There were people who were doing some really interesting pullouts and some really interesting kinds of, enrichment experiences with gifted kids. There were people who had Saturday programs who did some really interesting things. And one of the things I remember the most when we did our survey was two things, actually. One was the enrichment unit on architecture. That was really popular, as the kind of thing that happened on Saturdays or after school or in a pullout. And the second one was some kind of production, gifted kids involved in some kind of production. And the one that I'm kind of chuckling about was at the school where I started to teach, the principal, a great guy, really. But a first-year principal, as I was a first-year teacher, was trying to explain to me that the gifted kids would have a whole wall that they could do a panel on, and draw and color in. And I remember saying, are they all artistically gifted? And he said, that doesn't make any difference. We're giving them a whole wall, and they can decorate it. And those kinds of projects were really very much, part of what was labeled, quote, enrichment, end quote. So when, in fact, in 1994, this group was convened to answer the question, what should gifted kids really be doing, that as a state we could focus on, acceleration, depth, complexity, and novelty came into play. So acceleration came into play because, in fact, there was this real need to really answer the question, what is acceleration? Do you take a second grader and put them into sixth grade? Do you take a second grader and then run into the book room and grab the books from the third grade? What do you do? How do you answer that question? Depth and complexity came from a 1890s just about concept, the idea that one of the things that you should do is give gifted students more work and harder work. And you can actually go and trace that all the way back. So depth was looking at more work, and complexity was looking at harder work. And then of course you then wanted to ask the question, why do gifted kids want to be identified as gifted, right? And I remember that in terms of my own experience. You have one too. I know you do. And my experience was the first year I was a teacher, I was volunteered to do the Christmas play. Did any of you ever do that? I thought, this will be really fun. And I decided to do our version of the Nutcracker. And this is really great. And I had parents sewing costumes, and I had kids learning how to be snowflakes. I mean, I put a lot of energy into it. And then it was a great performance, and I'll never forget Bill, the principal, said, and so, Sandra, every year, this is what you could do. And I remember thinking to myself, this is what I was doing to gifted kids. You do this so well, how about more? Or you do this so well, let's continue it, kind of thing. So the depth and complexity came about in a very natural kind of way, trying to answer the question, how much, when, and what exactly do we mean? And novelty was something that came about in answer to the cry, very much, my friends, what in fact is the cry now. We need people who can problem solve, who can come with innovative ideas. We need, and in a sense, it was very similar to what we're talking about now in terms of STEM. Where are the kids interested in science and technology and engineering and math, who can problem solve, who can do new kinds of things. So we answered the question, and so I'd like to just briefly show you, and I'm sorry if this is redundant for some of you, but just to give us the same footage, in terms of what it is that we're talking about. Acceleration really was defined as a way to say that we are not leaving the core curriculum. So we're not saying a second grader should be doing fifth grade work unless we really have some legitimate way to do this. And excuse me, the research really shows that very few kids really need to have that physical kind of acceleration. But acceleration was the idea of looking at how you have working on two planes. One is the core curriculum, the curriculum that all kids need to learn. And the other one is looking at what is it we can do to move students on from that same starting point, whether it happens to be the unit on fairy tales or the unit on looking at the unknowns in math and an algorithm. Doesn't make any difference what that starting point is. But what can we do to keep accelerating what kids know? And one of the things that we said is, hey, look, there are 3 or 4 things that we could do. One is we could really teach the kids the nature of the disciplines. And somebody said, what? Well, I have to laugh because, quite honestly, teaching the nature of the disciplines, like instead of teaching plants, talking about botany, instead of teaching cells, really talking about biology, moving it to a higher plane of understanding. This was talked about in the 1930s by John Dewey. It was talked about in the 1960s by Jerome Bruner. This is not new. It's just that we've never really translated it. So that's where we got the idea, okay, let's have kids think like a disciplinarian. Boys and girls, when we were studying fairy tales, let's look at this from the standpoint of an environmentalist. Let's look at this as a standpoint of a political scientist. What then becomes important? Almost like a sieve, right? The idea that you're shaking this body of knowledge that is so large or includes so many different ideas into some kind of a form. So that was one thing. The other thing that we said is, wait a minute, Socrates and Plato, Aristotle had this long conversation, although I wasn't there. Although I've had kids say to me, were you there? And, kind of makes me wonder about the wrinkles. But anyway, one of the things that they talked about was that kids should really understand, or people that were well educated should understand big ideas. And those big ideas were related to what they talked about as beauty, love, power, okay? And there are big ideas. Some of you learned them and you probably really didn't even understand at the time how really valuable they were. I know that when I was in the second grade, Mrs. Starr, the second grade teacher, used to talk about this big idea. And the big idea was, which is kind of interesting because it's one of the ones I love to teach, is that change happens whether you like it or not. And it was really on the board in her beautiful, manuscript. Handwriting, I guess we call it. And what we wanted to have kids understand is that these big ideas are like umbrellas, okay? It's something that provides the catch-all or a way to put together all kinds of learning. Let me give you an example. So in language arts, the students are studying fairy tales, okay? And then in math, they're talking about the number line. And in social studies, they're talking about, the colonists. I know that this all doesn't go together, but you got the idea. And in science, they're talking about plants. And all of these are disjointed. But if you were to look at those under a big idea, like change is inevitable, or happens whether you like it or not, then you can look at the fact that fairy tales are built on change. That you can look at the fact that the number line is a way of being able to measure value and the changes in value. That, in fact, the colonists really was part of a change process. And plants change. We talk about, the whole process of photosynthesis. Or we could talk about all of these in terms of structure and the idea that structure follows function or form follows function. So the idea was, what can we do to pull it all together for kids so that you don't have these pieces that are, not really meshing? And then, interestingly enough, one of the things that we said was, acceleration would also be, if you don't mind, I'm going to put it here, the ability to learn the art of argumentation, to really learn how to argue. And there are people who say, gifted kids do that anyway. Yeah, but there's a difference between arguing and the art of argumentation. And here's a good example of how, in fact, now you see a correlation between the Common Core standards, pose and defend an argument, and that which we thought was a way to really accelerate. So, in the study of the core, and again, let's look at the colonist, one of the things that we could talk about is take a position. Here's the concept. Did the colonists flee to gain some kind of freedom only to sequester themselves and not really provide freedom to others? That's an interesting idea, isn't it? And so one of the things we could do is help kids take a position, find the evidence from many and varied sources, and argue the point. So in essence, what we start to look at is the idea of really making sure that acceleration is defined, that we can explain it to the kids, we can explain it to parents, and that we have some kind of a plane or trajectory that we can follow. On the other hand, depth and complexity were really part of a really interesting argument. And I'll never forget sitting there in that committee meeting when somebody said, what the heck do we mean by depth and complexity for kids that are gifted, besides the idea that it should be harder or more work? And so we got the idea of looking at the fact that there are some keys that all of us have learned, that really help to open the doors of understanding. Those keys are particular words that are relevant to the disciplines and hunting around inside of a discipline. So if I really wanted to hunt around, and let's just say something like biology, or if I really wanted to hunt around in something like political science, how do I walk into it? How do I get in there? And yeah, you could say ask who and when and where and why, but that's really too general. So one of the things that we said is, hey, this is kind of an interesting foot. There we go. I don't think it has enough digits. Whatever. Okay? But one of the things that we say then is the idea that there are certain kinds of words that will give you a chance to immerse yourself into that particular discipline. One is, all disciplines have patterns. Once you understand the pattern, you can understand the discipline. What is the pattern of the growth of a plant? What is the pattern of the growth of a cell? What is the pattern of a growth of a government? Okay? We could also look at what are some of the trends? What are some of the things that happen at one point that don't happen at another point? What are the things that we can talk about that was a trend, let's say, in the development of the colonies that is still a trend now or has been abolished? So that these are just key words to open up access to the disciplines. And there's some that you already know, you use them all the time. For you and me, they're second nature. We go see a film, like maybe you went to see, Saving Mr. Banks. One of the things you do, you looked at different points of view. One of the things that you did in watching this is you also watched the trends. You looked at the pattern of the personalities of Disney and the lady, right? You looked at, how in fact you could decipher some of the rules of good cinematography that they were trying to organize. You did that naturally and to make sense of it. And so we're just simply saying, let's teach it to kids in some structured way. Novelty became really interesting, and that was really kind of something that in many ways I still concern myself of. I'm not sure that we've done enough to help people understand that novelty was really to recognize aptitude in students and a chance for them to grow that aptitude. Because if you look at the group of our gifted students, even if they all got, at some point on a standardized test in the 99th percentile, they are not all alike. Tommy is really not necessarily endowed with potential in the same way as Mary Sue. And Mary Sue and Matilda are not necessarily alike. Some of our kids have a real bent in math. Some of our kids have a real bent in language arts. Some of our kids love the art of writing. Some of them, it's a task just to write their name, okay? So that part of what we need to look at is there someplace in the curriculum that we can recognize, appreciate, and respond to aptitude? And then this was also the bucket. Buckets are very popular right now, or the catch-all for teaching two things: creative thinking and the art of critical thinking. Not to say that you couldn't teach it with depth or complexity, not to say that you couldn't teach it with acceleration, but that you really wanted a place that anchored it. So I go into a classroom, okay, and I'm looking at a lesson, and I'm watching the teacher. So here's my teacher, and the teacher is teaching a lesson, and here I am watching. I am not evaluating the teacher as such. That's not what I'm doing. What I'm doing is looking at the checklist. Does this lesson provide differentiation in any opportunity of acceleration, of depth, complexity, and novelty? And that's why the GATE standards were there. So, one of the things I'm saying is I don't have to look at changing this lesson. The lesson is a lesson. It could even be the lesson in the book. It's fine. It's what I'm going to add to that lesson to give it the differentiation it needs. And I can do that by taking away that part that the students already know, or I can really add to what they already know and start to enrich it. Therein lies the concept of differentiation. Not a different curriculum, but a curriculum that differs in acceleration, depth, complexity, and novelty. And incidentally, we are probably one of the only states that has so clearly defined what standards are for gifted students. Okay, questions or comments? Okay, so then let's look at what an issue is. The issue is that when we talk about differentiation, do we stop there, or do we really need to look at the fact that there's more to it? And here's the argument I want to pose to you, and that is, you build the regular curriculum, we differentiate off the regular curriculum, we are really pleased to be able to do this, there's no argument there. But what in fact we need to say is, does that really allow for the diversity? Because we're not doing that necessarily. What we're doing is we're saving gifted students, if that's the term you want to use, from the fact that they would get lost in the total of a core curriculum by differentiating. But then there's one other step, and that is we need to individualize. We need to start to look at the fact that Johnny may be a different learner than Mary Sue, even though they're in the same class, even though the same grade, even though they were tested on the same kind of test. They are differing. And we need to look at the fact that the real goal was not to stop at differentiation and say, that's great. It was to move toward individualization. Now, not every lesson in every part of the day, come on, we know that. But one of the things I want to say is we only have done the job to a small degree. So let's talk about the diversity of learners, and let's talk about what we might do to accommodate them. So I've thought about some of them. Would you be thinking about some that you would like to add to the list? So under academic, I'm very interested in academic diversity, not in terms of aptitude, but in terms of behaviors. Do you know the reluctant learner? Do we have to do this? Yes. Why? Well, Well, are you sure? That really hesitancy on the part of a learner. Or do you know the etymologist that has so many words and you don't almost want to call on the kid because they go on and on. And I could have used another word, but I decided not to. This is a child that just always has something to say. And so can I tell you about Mark? Mark was in my class. It feels like 1,000 years ago, although it really wasn't. And Mark was very interested in insects. And he would always want to share. And of course, obviously he needed to have the opportunity to share. And this is how it went. I'm going to talk to you about the third grade. I'm going to talk to you about the 3 parts of the body of an insect. Now, there are 3 parts, and he named the parts. And I want to talk to you about the antenna. The antenna are very, very important. I can see that some of you don't believe me. Now, antenna are like what you have with your TV. Now, that is a transmitter. And you understand that it's really important to get that transmission, because if you don't, then, and he would go on. And the longer he spoke, the more obtuse it became, the more expert-like he was, but the more the novice population would just kind of stare at him. And then he'd stop and he'd say, "Do you get it?" And the class almost in unison would say, "No." And then he would be devastated. And I know him as an adult, and we talk about this all the time because, believe it or not, he's a teacher. And one of the things that he says, when I see that look of a Mark, I know I've done something wrong. Okay, this is the kid who has the language patterns and is overzealous and doesn't know how to temper the amount of information they have to the population or to the setting, and therefore always feels maligned because somebody's not listening, because somebody doesn't get it. And you know what that feels like, because I don't know about you, but I teach. And even though I teach at the graduate level, I get the same kind of response sometimes that Mark did when I've gone into an area, not made it clear, and people kind of just look at me with that bewildered look. Then there's the perfectionist, and you know a lot about the perfectionist. People are perfectionists for different reasons. Some people call this a real psychological issue. I think it's an academic issue. I mean, have you ever been so involved in something that you wanted to be really good? I can think of one situation. We had an artist in the days when we had more money in schools that came in and was teaching kids how to draw. And he chose, for some reason, to have the kids draw what's known as an ear of corn. Okay? So there was one kid that drew the ear of corn like this, which I thought was pretty clever, quite frankly. And he drew the ear of corn, like this, showing some of the... I'm sorry, I still find it humorous. The art teacher just about had a fit. I said, draw an ear of corn. I am drawing an ear of corn. Well, that's not exactly it. He said, you're right. I need to put another one on the other side. So the art teacher didn't necessarily have a lot of friends. The one person who I still remember was a student who drew the art of the ear of corn with every single solitary kernel and had gone up to actually count kernels to make sure that her count was exactly, and I'm telling you, I thought the art teacher was going to go mad. You don't have to do it. It's a symbolic representation. And Carol said, I want it to be perfect. It doesn't have to be perfect. It can be artistic. And very kindly, the teacher opened up an art book and said, look, this is a flower. Van Gogh did this flower. Does it look exactly like a flower? I don't want to be Van Gogh. And this is what she said. I want to be a photographer. I want it to look exactly as it is. And so it's really interesting. The counselor said, I think she's got a problem. I don't think so. I think she had in her mind an idea of what she wanted, and she was trying to translate that. So I don't want to see perfectionistic as just something that is a psychological variable. There are kids who are very disorganized. Have you seen the ones that can't find their pencil? By the time it's time to find their pencil, the task is over. So we know some of these. These are not gifted. These are very gifted kids, just like all other kids. But how do we individualize for these students, understanding that I cannot do 32 lessons, but I can start to think about how I can have some latitude in any differentiated lesson that would allow my accommodation for these kids. So let's look at some of the linguistic kids. There are those who are English learners. There are those who are very shy and are very, 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 their language patterns are stilted. They're hesitant, not because they don't know English, but because they don't want to be necessarily present to speak it. We have those who are very linguistically, who are very bored. It's not that they can't speak or they don't have the language, they're just not interested in speaking. And we have those that are overly zealous, and we use language patterns that really excel. They're language patterns that really are far beyond, the average concept of what that age grade would be. Okay, under economics, I want you to think about some of the issues of economic differences among kids. So we have gifted kids from all different economic strata. Have you thought about economic poverty? We have kids in Los Angeles, in the schools I work in on a regular basis, that are 7 miles from the ocean and have never seen it. They have never touched the sand. They have never smelled the sea. The only thing they've seen are pictures that we provide in textbooks, okay? We have kids that are environmentally ignorant. And I'm one of those. I was mentioning to some of you that were there yesterday that, I'm native Californian. I've lived in Los Angeles all my life. I don't see snowfall very often. I could never drive in snow. I don't get it. I barely can drive in rain. Luckily, there's no rain. No, I'm teasing about that. But that's not luckily. But I'm limited. I have ignorant areas that absolutely, and very different than some of my colleagues who lived in different parts of the United States and have very different kinds of experiences than I do. And we have gifted kids who are environmentally curious. They want to poke around. They want to know what's behind something. I found, I work in a school that's in a state of kind of being renovated. I guess that's the best way to say it. So there are big potholes on the playground and lots of different kinds of fences and areas that are blocked off. And there are 3 or 4 kids, and I happen to know them because they're part of a class that I deal with and work in. And those kids think it's the best thing that ever happened to them because they're poking around to find out what kind of bugs are down there. And no matter how many times the person comes and says, get away, can you see it says stay away, they are intrigued by the fact that they can find something that makes me a little bit, queasy, that they think is fabulous. Look, Dr. Kaplan, look at this. Look at how many legs it has. Interesting, Okay. We also have kids that have different cultural kinds of dimensions to them. We are kids who are striving and trying to maintain their cultural identity. That's not what we do. That's not how we do it. We have a set of children that come from a very mountainous area of Mexico that are very, 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 very clear about keeping the mores of their particular culture alive, and there are certain things they don't want to do because it's not what they did when they lived in that particular section of Mexico. We have kids that have cultural prohibitions, kids that are not supposed to get dirty when they come to school, and so really kind of stay away from some of the kinds of things that might be considered to be dirty, like clay or working with the blocks in our primary grades. And kids, incidentally, whose cultural prohibitions are also related to certain things that they can or cannot read. Okay, this is the group of gifted children we don't talk a lot about, and this is the group that I want us to start to think about in terms of diversity. How can I, not on a one-on-one, but how can I, within the context of a lesson, after I have differentiated it, how can I go through the process of starting to really help these students maintain their identity or move them in a way that will help them to enrich who they are so that they can move further on the continuum of their abilities. So let me stop here. Who would you add to the list, or any one of these areas? Kids that you know. Yes, please.
I find it interesting that there isn't a social category.
Interesting.
I think it might be learners that can
Good point.
And I consider, I think it's within all students, but I've noticed with gay students in particular that there's a desire on the part of some to be a leader.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost as if that they're just dying for that role. And then I also find that there's a particular type of student that's just very team-oriented. It's almost like the perfectionist you were talking about, except the perfection is everything working together.
Mm-hmm. Those are really good points. Let me tell you why, not defensively, but why I accidentally left off the social. I was thinking about the 4 areas that are in the state law, and it says that, to look at gifted kids of diversity, academic, linguistic, economic, and cultural. And you brought up an excellent point. I'm so glad. Thank you. That's really helpful. Under the social, I'd like to also bring attention to the kids that want to follow. You really want to be followers. And one of the teachers said to me, I don't understand if I should really allow a student to be such a follower when he has the ability to be the leader. Some of us don't want to lead. Some of us want to follow. And, again, there could be no leadership without followership, so we need followers, especially good followers. And I think there's also somebody else that we could put in here, and that's the kid that likes to be isolated, that likes to be alone. So I don't want to use the word isolated, but alone. And, it's really interesting. There was a group of us that were talking about the last 3-day weekend that we had, and somebody said, as my colleagues, and somebody said to somebody, so what did you do? And the person said, nothing. Oh, that's too bad. Oh, no, she said, no, I'm really happy. I was never so happy. It was 3 days of real pleasure. She said, I didn't talk on the phone. I didn't talk to my husband. I just was by myself thinking about things I wanted to think about. It was a pleasure. And I thought, we don't really allow for that kind of appreciation of solace. We really don't. It's kind of interesting. We think there's something wrong. Then somebody said, that's interesting. I only like to go to the movies alone. What? You go to the movies alone on Saturday night? Yeah, I like not having anybody I have to talk to, so I completely focus on it. I think it's interesting. So I would add that to the category. Anything else that you would like to add? The kids that you know? Yes, please.
I would add
Competitor. Ah, interesting. Can I ask you a question? What do you think causes that competition? Do you think it's innate, or do you think it's socialized in terms of...
I don't think it's innate. No, I don't think it's born in them.
Huh, that's interesting. I've always wondered about that, and for a while I was working with a pediatrician who was also a child psychologist, and his comment was that we see sometimes the outward manifestation of competition, which is really competing against oneself. And incidentally, I think there's some relationship here between perfectionism and competition. And I do think there's some competition amongst others that we learn, that we teach kids. One of the kids said to me, you know how you turn over the cards, the green card, the red card, and the yellow card in a behavioral situation? One of the kids said to me, you know, it really has nothing to do with my behavior. It has to do with others' behavior. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, if they're all having to turn their cards, I don't want to. So the cards themselves meant nothing to him. He was looking at how he could stand out as, quote, because his next comment was, the good kid. Kind of like the good wife, you know, the good kid. So I think they brought up an interesting point. Thank you. Others that you would like to add? Yes, please. I'm sorry? Ah. You know, you bring up something I hadn't really thought about in years. There was some work that was done on gifted kids, and I'm sorry, I can't bring forth the name of the person who did it. But he talked about the 5 things that were so much a part of giftedness that we ignore. One was the fear of failure. Another one was the fear of success. Geez, I've forgotten about these. And people say, oh, come on. No, my friends. The fear of success is a really interesting idea, because the more success you breed, the more we expect of you. The other one was not only the fear of failure and the fear of success, but the fear of opportunity. The idea that, in fact, if there were a lot of opportunities, then you had to avail yourself of them. So in a sense, it was easier not to see what was out there than, to really look at what was out there. And then the other one was the fear of magical ability. I'm so glad you brought this up. The fear of magical ability always interested me. You know what that is? That the kids didn't really understand the nature of how they became gifted, and some kids really believe it's magic, and less, in fact, the magic is gone. And I'll never forget, in a study that was done, they asked second graders, why were you gifted? And many of the kids said it was because of magic. And one kid said, I'm wondering if I lose my teeth, if that means that I'll lose some of my brains. Not really understanding what in fact we know is that ability really has either heredity, environment, or as Abe Tannenbaum said, luck, or the fact that there are lots of factors that go into ability. So thank you so much. I just wish I could remember the person who wrote all of this. It was in the 60s and 70s that this was a real popular construct. Thanks. Okay, so let's talk about some of the things that we want to do to really individualize. And one of the things that we want to do is just to teach kids generally some of the kinds of issues. So let me explain some of these. One of them is that for many of us, we think from the outside in rather than the inside out. And so we have students that really diminish their own individuality by trying to look at what the norm is rather than what they really believe. So, for example, my best example is sitting in a 9th grade class where the kids had read To Kill a Mockingbird, and the teacher said, so who is the major character? Who is the protagonist? And one of the kids said, Atticus. And they said, yeah, Atticus, the father, absolutely. Well, one kid raised his hand and said, no, I disagree. It was really Tom. Tom is Robinson, the one that was being accused of the crime and put on trial, the one that Atticus is trying to defend. And the teacher said, no, that's not true. That's a secondary character. That's not a primary character. And this kid stood his ground and said, look, and he's actually shaking his finger. Look, he said, if it wasn't for Tom, there'd be no need to have an Atticus. He's got to be the main character. And the teacher said, well, in this class, we agree by consensus. And that was my first kind of understanding about, no, wait a minute, this kid was thinking from the the inside out and not the outside in, and wasn't given any credit for it. I think right now there's some issues, and the Common Core allows us to do this. You are allowed to think from the inside out if you can defend your point of view, if you can use supportive evidence, if in fact I can show you that it's logical. And what I've done is I'm just taking out some of the skill sets that are inside those anchor standards in language arts and social studies. I don't have to say, well, that's not what we all agreed on. I have to say, what evidence do you have for that? Where did you get that evidence? How credible is that evidence? And in this classroom, you're allowed to have another point of view, as long as you can defend it and that you can show the if-then relationship. If, then, because. Really simple. That's what reasoning logically is all about. A second issue is an issue that has to do with being your own judge of your own thoughts. That some of our kids are talking before they're thinking. And, and I do that too. I mean, have you done that where you put your foot in your mouth and you think, oh, shoot, why did I say that? But one of the things I'm trying to say is, look, before you speak, think about the criteria that you would use before you announce it. Again, a skill of the Common Core standards. So it's not that we're just talking about fluff, or we're just not talking about the psychological dimensions of something. We're talking honestly about the idea of looking at the fact that you are responsible for what you say, in terms of being able to give it some kind of rationale. What criteria you're using. So you'll hear, and I've been working in preschools, which is very, very interesting, and we're trying to uncover giftedness among very young kids. It's amazing. I think that character is really mean because, first of all, he took away those beans from the other character. Secondly, you're not supposed to take anything away from somebody else. That's wrong. And so the kids, even though they're young, they're only 4.5, 5 years old, are starting to look at the criteria that they use. The only thing I can tell you is that one of the mothers wasn't very happy because she said to the child in response to, can I go to so-and-so's house to sleep overnight? And she said no. And the child said, what criteria do you have? And she says, I don't have to have criteria. And, I'm your mother. And so the child said, you're not thinking logically then. So that wasn't a good scene, I have to admit. We need to help kids understand how you play some of this out in a home situation. Another one is having the courage to think it, having the courage to really do it. This is something that I think goes back to what the gentleman shared so well, and that is fear of failure. Where do you get the courage to think about it? Where do you get the courage to say it? Where do you get the courage to understand that that's what we're really talking about? What good is the potential if you're really afraid to use it? And so I want to go back one step to the artist in the picture. One of the things that I thought was so interesting is that when I said, I want you to hang this picture, Billy, on our art gallery, and you can name it and hang it. He said, oh, no, it's not like everybody else's. And I said, but if you go to the art galleries, not everybody's picture is alike. Not everybody drew the flowers in the same way. Not everybody shows that landscape in the same way. And he said, I'm afraid. I don't want the kids to laugh at me. I think one of the things that I feel guilty about is I'm never really taught, how do you have the courage to be different? Because on the same hand, how are you creative if you don't have courage? How can you develop new ideas? How can you problem solve and come up with a new understanding if there's no courage for it? So that becomes an important factor in individualization. And as does the other thing, and that is thinking is hard work. Thinking is hard work. To really be able to write a good differentiated lesson is hard work, okay? And I'm not sure that we give real credence to the idea that some things are hard. It's, and that it's okay. It's okay. It doesn't diminish you if it takes you longer to do it. It doesn't diminish you if you've had to, quote, sweat in the process. And so those are some of the things we want to talk about in terms of the thinking, the demeanor, the kind of attitudinal reference that you have. And now we can look at, okay, what are we going to do to really make this happen? So here's some of the things that we're going to do. We're going to literally look at how we can avoid academic prejudice, how we don't think that all gifted kids are alike and prejudicially get really annoyed if the kid says they're bored, or if a child says, I can't do this, or if a kid says, why are we doing this? Or if a kid says, hey, is there more to do? That we understand those differences. And that what we do is we look at the fact that some of what we do creates really dissonance on the part of our gifted kids. Watch this. If this is the way we do it, and this is the outcome that we want, and we tell kids that there's only one way to do it, that there are fixed means to a fixed end, you are to do it this way to get this outcome, you have discounted some of our kids who need a little bit more freedom and wiggle room. If we say that there are many different ways to do something, and it doesn't make any difference how it comes out, then you've given them too much latitude for them to really start to understand the parameters of success. So what we're really advocating is multiple means to fixed ends, boys and girls. We will all write a short research paper. We talked about this with some of you yesterday. It's part of the Common Core standards. This is not negotiable. What is negotiable, my friends, is the topical area that you're going to choose. What is negotiable are the kinds of resources you're going to use. What is negotiable is how many pages. And I may not give all of those. I may say non-negotiable topic, non-negotiable, the idea of, the fact that you need print and non-print. Non-negotiable, it has to be 3 pages. Well, I thought you were going to give us some freedom. I am. I didn't tell you which print and non-print to use. I didn't tell you how many paragraphs. I didn't tell you anything like that. So we need to help kids understand the parameters of freedom. Well, I should say freedom within the parameters. Okay, so this is one issue. Now, I'm not giving up the fact that I have particular kinds of ends that they have to meet. I'm not saying, well, hey, if you want to write a short research paper, that's fine. If you don't, that's fine too. That's not negotiable. And so one of the things that we've done with our kids in trying to help them understand their diversity and where it comes into play, to deal with that reluctancy or to deal with that fear of failure, or to deal with a kid who's overzealous, to say, look, think about school as a times when concept. There are times when I will choose and you will do, okay? That's it. There are times when you will choose and I will accept. There are times when you will work alone and times when you will work together. And I will be honest enough to tell you what the expectations are, because then we have a chance to tap into the different diversity, the reluctant learner, or the kid that wants to be a team person, or the kid that has a particular bent, to want to do it one way versus another. And I think that there's an honesty factor. I've noticed a change in some of the behaviors of kids when, in fact, we have been real honest in saying, here are the choices, and these are choices within parameters. Okay. We also want to help kids understand that they're not blank slates. Because one of the things that I want to acknowledge is that many of our students already have abilities that they can bring to the task. So I don't want to go through the fact of saying, okay, you're going to write a short paragraph, and many of you don't know how, I'm sorry, let's just say a short paragraph. And many of you do not necessarily know how to do that, so be careful, listen carefully. I don't want to go through the process of saying, listen up, this is something you don't know. You've never talked about the idea of the water cycle before. You better listen up. This is really something you're going to need if you're ever going to take a serious science class. I want to say, what do you already know? And one of the things I want the kids to be able to do is to take an inventory, excuse me, of what they know against the objective. Boys and girls, today's objective, excuse me, is the idea that we are going to categorize different animals in order to, from a variety of sources. And what we're going to do is go through the process then of being able to create a chart showing the differences between them. Think about the objective. We're going to be categorizing. We're going to be studying animals. We're going to be using a variety of resources. We're going to be forming a chart. What do you bring to the task that will enable you to do this well from the standpoint of who you are? So Sammy says, oh, I love charts. Can we make one of those charts with those overlapping circles? You mean a Venn diagram? Yeah, that would be one way to do it. I don't like charts. Well, what can we do to make that better? Because there's different kind of charts. You can think about a Venn diagram. You can think about some kind of chart that shows a flow chart. You could think about a timeline, but you will make a chart. So there are choices within the parameters. I absolutely love snakes. Well, that's great, because one of the animals that you can study could be reptiles. So the point that I think we want to do is to help the kids understand that you're walking in half full, and there's not a mismatch, there's a match. Now psychologically, to the degree that I can make this a match is to the degree that I can start to help them understand the individualization process, that they don't get lost. And one of the things that I've studied, which has been interesting, is something called loss of self. You have all experienced this. As a matter of fact, I was at a meeting this morning online and amongst some of my colleagues, and I could feel that I had a different point of view. Do you know what that feels like? And you feel like you're losing yourself? You know, and that happens, to all of us. Have you felt it politically? Have you felt it socially? One of the things I need to look at is that I've got some things I can do about it. I can either, go through the process of withdrawing and becoming, less of an active member of a group or that situation or that task, or I can figure out what is making me feel that way and move toward it. And that's what this is. I don't want the kids to lose themselves. On the other hand, there's no negotiation here. There are fixed ends here. You will categorize. You will study animals. You will use a variety of resources. You will make a chart. But there's some latitude there, and that can match, who they are. And I can do it in a variety of ways. One of the teachers that I'm working with actually has kids do an inventory. So they do a self-inventory, very much like you would do if you were working for Whole Foods or Nordstrom's or one of the stores. You do an inventory. And you could do it categorically. What do I know about math that I'm taking with me? What am I really good at in terms of science, or what do I really like? This particular teacher has it divided into two areas, good and likes, and you can use any language patterns you want. And the kids have their inventory, okay? And before he starts his lesson, he says, take out your inventory, look at what the objective of the lesson is, or look at what the standard is, see how it either enhances or has some need factor for who you are. So Matilda might say, oh man, this is terrific, look, it really matches what I'm good at. On the other hand, she could say, geez, this is a lesson in history, it doesn't match what I'm good at, it doesn't match what I like. And then the next question is, so what is your responsibility? And I think that's really important. I mean, all of us do this. All of us do this. You just do it quickly. You just do it as a matter of a variety of factors. I mean, I do it when I do technology. Ooh, I'm not so good at this. I need to do X, Y, Z then to be able to do this. I really like doing this. This is going to be fun. So we do this all the time. Okay. The other thing is that we're talking about readiness and building readiness. So one of the things that we're doing right now is we're involved in a study with gifted students, and it is a year study. They are 3rd and 4th graders, and I'll tell you why, if you're interested, we chose that grade. We're asking them what differentiation do they favor and why. And one of the things that the research so far has showed us is that one of the things that they are most unhappy about is that teachers start the lesson assuming that they are half empty rather than half full, and that teachers don't bother motivating them. They're assuming that the motivation is inherent or intrinsic. So this is kind of what we're talking about in terms of teaching. Now, don't get me wrong. When I show you this, you've got to make some decisions. Do you do this much of this, or do you do just that much of that? So, that's something you need to decide. But as we're moving up, we've said that we want to motivate our kids by trying to bring it to personal lessons. Personal experiences. That, we've got to, even in our most really high need schools, where our kids are really very, very limited in some of the background experiences they have, we can still bring in personal experiences. We're trying then to see if we can give the kids some simulation. So, for example, we did return it, I promise you, and got a jar of sand from the Santa Monica beach and had the kids just feel it, the kids who had never felt sand. And we sifted it and looked at all the stuff and so forth that's in it, some of which is not very pleasant. And then we returned it, I promise you, to the beach, because you're not supposed to take the sand. I understand that. But kidding aside, we wanted them to have a simulated experience. How do you study oceanography? And how do you do it with any kind of zest if you've had no experiences? We then try to really look at what do we already know. And a lot of the things that came out were, I saw a movie. Lots of the kids had seen The Life of Pi. And they said, is the water really like that? I mean, have you ever seen the Pacific Ocean where that water is really like that and it comes over the ship and whatever? Then we introduced what we're going to be studying and started the lesson. Okay, look at this string here. And you can see, where do you get the reluctant learner? Where do you get the kid that says, we've already studied that? Where do you get the kid who has a fear of failure? Where do you get the kid who, has, a need to want to be kind of left alone? Where in this lesson do I start to look at possibilities? So let me stop for a moment. Questions or comments from you? As you look at this pattern. Oh, come on. One of the things we talk about is time. Do we have time to do this? Yes, please.
I love the building readiness thing, and it really does tap into all the other learners, but I think sometimes, too, it's not necessarily at the start of a lesson. I mean, I have the luxury of having the class all day. And I know sometimes in the morning, for example, when I'm discussing the agenda, just the mere mention of saying something like, all you team-oriented people this afternoon, you're going to love this because you're going to be in groups. Sometimes that's all I need to do, and I'm already thinking about that ahead. If you have a multiple subject thing going on, or a single subject thing going on, you could say that on Monday about the lesson on Friday. I think you could refer to it clearly.
That's really very interesting. You're talking about something that I have really thought about but have done nothing about. And that is to really also show the kids the pattern of learning. So one of the things is, boys and girls, the lesson today is going to look very much like this. So I wanted just to show you a pictorial representation of the lesson. And let's just not say today. Let's just say over the week. We're going to have, in our study in science, we'll have some whole group. Then we're working in small groups. You'll have some chance to work alone. And then we're going to come back and work in a whole group. That kind of prerequisite, and I don't want to use prerequisite, but almost an anticipatory understanding of what's going to happen, I think is really an interesting idea. The other thing is, boys and girls, in this lesson or this unit of study, you will have an opportunity, and this we have done some of, you will have an opportunity to use this. The kids laugh at my drawing. Don't laugh. We'll have an opportunity to use this. You'll have an opportunity to use, this is paintbrush. You'll have an opportunity to sit around and do a lot of this, and you'll have an opportunity to do some of this. Okay, think about those different activities and think about, which ones of those might be the ones that you would most want to align yourself with. So that's something that I think might be really interesting, kind of giving the roadmap. I was thinking about something the other day. I got a very, very interesting announcement about a trip to Cuba that one of the universities is conducting. And what they did was they showed every day what you would do, but within every day, it broke it down to kind of, where you'd be eating and whether you'd be in a group or have, and I thought, my gosh, why don't I do an itinerary for kids? Which is what you're really saying. That's very interesting. Thanks for sharing that. Other comments? Please.
When you mentioned, do we have time to do all that? I work with middle school students, and if I have the buy-in, that's everything. The rest of the day, the rest of the lesson is just cake. And they're eager, and I don't have the classroom management issues, and I don't have to reteach so much.
Interesting
so I think
point.
if you put forth the time and effort to scaffold a lesson like that, to prepare them, then it pays off in the other end.
It really, there's research that shows that you can reduce classroom management if you can do more of this. And I think more of what you're talking about here, too. And the thing about time, though, is really interesting. Nobody says it has to take a lot of time. I don't have to spend 40 minutes doing this. And I certainly don't have to spend, even 15 minutes to do this. It can be really something that you're moving through. It doesn't have to be something that you have to linger forever. So I think that's an important point. And here's one that we actually did. We were really interested in helping the kids understand the nature of systems, and systems is a universal concept. It is one of the ones, too, that we want kids to understand, that all systems, here's the big idea, are made of parts, and those parts work together or interact. I even talked about this yesterday. So here's our lesson. We started with just asking kids, so what steps do you have or go through in order to do homework? We talked about designing a system what system or steps, It's just giving kids to talk about what they already know about systems. What systems do you use to organize certain things in your home or here at school? Then we introduced the circulatory system, which was the science lesson. And then we talked about the fact that we wanted to really get to a bigger picture. So we talked about the idea of systems of government, looking at interdisciplinarity, and then looking at different branches of the government, all to prove that systems are made out of parts, which brings me to another point, which I probably should have said before this, and that is one of the things that we've been able to do to really deal with this diversity among students is to look at more interdisciplinary learning. So we have really tried not to dissipate the intentionality or not to take away from the core curriculum in any way, but if this is the core and it is a study of plants, that we look at all the tangential things we can do to go through the process of showing how, in fact, that study of plants can, in fact, be extended to other disciplines. Once you understand the nature of plants and how they grow, then we can talk about how we, quote, grow societies, the colonies. We could talk about, so we've got the colonist again, we're talking about social studies. We can talk about how, in fact, we can, quote, grow numbers. We could talk about operations, place value, etc. We could talk about how, in fact, we can look at the idea of growth in a novel or in a story. And we can use it euphemistically, we can use it, in its more clear and precise manner, but it's moving it out. And that interdisciplinarity has made a big difference for some of the kids because they're noting that their time to get involvement is coming. And now some of the kids bring it up on their own. They'll say, if we're talking about plants, that's very much like the way, in fact, you can, and they'll come up with an idea. So then we started to get more sophisticated, and what we're starting to do is really looking at how, and incidentally, I will send this material to you, and they will, if they want it, they're welcome to have it. But we're trying to show individuality amongst kids. So let me show you how we're doing it. And I want to do it, if you don't mind, first of all, with the problem-solving strip, okay? So we're saying, look, there are particular steps to problem solving. There's no argument about this. In order to problem solve, you need to be able to define the problem. You need to know how to state a potential or a possible solution. You need to gather your information. You need to organize the information, state a solution, and then convince others. And this is part of the archival work of Paul Torrance, of Treffinger, etc. So, we didn't make these up. But what, in fact, we want kids to know is that after we have learned these, okay, then what we can do is start to look at diversity among learners. Okay, so incidentally, problem solving is also one of the skills that not only is part of novelty, but problem solving is also one of the areas in the Common Core standards. Okay, so let me just get them here. And yes, I tear a lot of paper because we need to look at things in other than a static way. Okay, so boys and girls, we're going to try to solve the problem of the fact that there is a drought, okay? And the need to really look at how we might be able to share water with maybe other states, maybe with other regions, etc. Okay, now I want you to think about ways that you would do it. So here comes a kid that is really very, very verbal, a potential leader. Says the first thing I would do, I would try to convince people that I really have a good solution because I would organize my information in order to help them understand that, in fact, I understand the problem and I have a solution. I even have evidence to prove it. Notice where that child started from. I'm going to convince you, okay? But let's take another child. Let's take the reluctant learner. And this is what she actually did. I couldn't solve the problem unless I read a lot about it. I have to know a lot about it. And then what I need to do is then I need to really make sure that, first I have to look at the problem. Then I have to look at a lot about it. Then I'm going to try to, sorry, I still did it wrong. Then what I have to do is I have to come up with a solution, but I'm not really sure about my solution, so I'm going to come up with another solution. Maybe it will be better. I may have to read again. And then what I'm going to do, I'm going to write it down, and I'm going to get somebody else to talk about it. Is she still practicing problem solving? Absolutely, positively. Then somebody says, I don't like working alone. I don't want to do it alone. This is a big thing. So I'm going to find a friend. Who are you going to find? I'm going to find somebody that really talks good. So I'm going to find a friend. This is my friend's job. And I don't like reading so much. So I'm going to get another friend. And that's what they'll do. They'll do that, and I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to define the problem. I'll state the solution. And then I'm going to have my friends get the information. I'll be happy to organize it and then make sure that it really is a good solution, and then my friend can talk about it. We got team building. So one of the things we're trying to do is to use our learning strips to start to help kids to look at the many and varied ways that a particular skill or a particular idea can take on different dimensionality based on my needs. Debbie is a really good friend of mine, and we work together there are things that she does far better than I. So, Debbie is really kind of fearless and convincing. I would really let her do that job. But quite frankly, I like to search through the information. But she can organize it. She does great work on the computer. To see the idea of looking at how we can start to see who we are as individuals and how we can put it together in order to really make some sense out of it. So I'm not abdicating responsibility. I'm looking at how it might be best suited to who I am. Okay, questions or comments about this or other points of view? Okay, I guess it's making sense. So let me show you another one. As one of the things that a kid once said to me was, "Yeah, it makes sense to you." Okay, we're really interested in teaching collaboration. That's part of two different areas. One is the Common Core standards that really are asking for kids to be more collaborative. Incidentally, there is research that is showing that it's not just how much you know about a subject, but that you're willing to work with others to coalesce information, to get an idea across, or to invent, a particular entity that would solve a problem. So we're talking about the collaboration learning strip, and one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to look at what goes into collaboration. You need to have a goal. So the first thing you need to look at is the idea of being able to have a goal. The second thing that you need to do is you need to be able to define your own expertise before you can work with somebody. And the third thing you need to do is learn how to work together. Okay? So if I were to tear these apart, after I've taught them to the kids, then watch what happens. A child who is a real follower says, I want to make sure that I know who the group is and what they're trying to do, and then they can see whether or not they want me there. Somebody else says, not me. I'm going to tell everybody what I can do and how that is really important for the goal, and they'll want to choose me. Another kid says, no. I need to really look at what the goal is and who's working together, and if in fact, I have any expertise. So I think I need to do that, because before I join, I need to see whether or not these two go together. And so what we're looking at is, here is what it is that we need to teach you. We need to teach you the steps of collaboration. Here's what we want you to do, is to start to look at how you mix and match those to start to assert your dimensions of how you are a diverse individual. And again, it could be the social dimensions, it could be the academic dimensions, it could be the linguistic dimensions, it could be any one of those things. I can't individualize always for you. At some point, you've got to individualize for yourself. And so just one more, and that's the one that is the reasoning learning strip. Again, I'm trying to show the three that are part of the Common Core standards. But on this one, this has been the hardest one. In looking at reasoning, you've got to be able, that's a very bad word, you have to be able to understand the because. Why is this going to be as it is? You need to know how to form conclusions, and you need to know how to make it known. And I want to star this for just a moment. There is research that shows that there are people who are very gifted who have never realized their potential because they didn't know how to get it out there. There's something that was talked about that always disturbed me. There was a comment that was made by Paul Torrance years ago that said there may be more creative innovations in the drawers of people's desks or in the attic in some kind of trunk that never gets out there because people don't know how to get it out there. So have we really taught kids how to make an idea known in a positive, productive way that matches your personality? I don't think I would feel comfortable, knocking on doors. I know that. I could barely sell Girl Scout cookies. One of the reasons I got chubby as a kid, I think we ate them all in the house. Because I just would not go to the doors. I hated that. And I'm not good at that. I am not good at selling. I may be able to sell an idea, but I'm not good at selling any commodity. And so one of the things I know about myself is I need somebody else to do that. I need somebody else to do that. Okay, you all have some things that you know about your ability. Somebody said something to me which I really thought was very, very clever. He said, I can sell anything, I just don't know how to develop it. How many of you watch Shark Tank? Isn't that interesting? I mean, isn't that fascinating? It's on Friday nights, and if you have nothing to do on this Valentine's evening, then watch Shark Tank. And I watch it just from the standpoint of watching how people present ideas and people's responses to it. And it's very interesting. So I'm going to tear this apart, and this is something that I need to figure out. I need to figure out that I am really good at forming conclusions. I love the because. So these two really are going to go together. I'm going to have to get somebody else to make it known. Somebody else says, no, 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 no. You have to do it all. So that one of the things I need to think about is, if I'm really strong on the because, and I can make it known and follow it up with conclusions, that might be helpful. Or conversely, maybe I need to come to conclusions, learn how the fact that making it known will be stronger. I'll have greater efficacy if, in fact, I can have more understanding of the because. Okay, different learners doing it different ways, but all using the same skill set. So that's one way we're individualizing. Let me show you a couple of more. One of the things that we're interested in is a little bit more difficult, and so don't be floored by this, because somebody said to me, oh, that is so hard. It's not really. Let me show you the kind of thinking that we're going through, and then let me get some of your responses, both positive or negative, about it. I am going to look at the curriculum, okay? So one thing I'm going to look at is the fact that I need to teach what's known as the core curriculum, and I'm going to take something out of literature, if you don't mind. I need to teach the genre, and you know that that's a really intricate part of what is known as the Common Core Standards. So I'm going to teach the genre. Now, I have two kids I'm really worried about. One is the kid that is not participatory. So I'm talking about the gifted kid who's a great reader, fabulous reader, but a real loner. And then I also want to tell you that I have another kid. I have another kid that no matter what we're going to read, I've already read that, which is really not true. You know, it's a little bit of a game, but okay. So this is the one that's boring. And the thing I really can't stand is, I'm going to tell my mother. This kid has got it down pat. So I've got these two kids to worry about. Now, I have all kinds of options, so let me show you my options. And again, we will send you this if you're interested in, quote, working with it. But here's my options. The degree of emphasis I'm going to place on something. Here's another option, the grouping pattern. Here's another option, looking at developmental readiness. Another option, looking at the kid's potential. Another option, looking at instructional strategies. And another option, looking at the planning. So let me go back, and I'm going to kind of jump around, if you don't mind, a little bit. Knowing that this kid is a learner, I'm going to really focus in on grouping. Here are my choices. I can have the kids work in a whole group, a small group, or independently. I care a lot about the kids learning the genre. I care a lot about that. This might be a great opportunity for the loner to actually be able to work independently. There's no reason why you have to work in a group to understand the differences between a myth and a fable and a fairy tale, science fiction. There's no reason. So I'm going to do that. The child who is always complaining about being bored, I am going to really think about something here. And that is, I'm going to go down here to instructional strategies. The choices in instructional strategies are direct instruction, inquiry, and independent study. And I am going to have this student participate in an inquiry-based lesson. I'm going to have you read 5 different selections, and your job is to figure out what are the likenesses and differences between them. And you will, because I'm also now going to do this, you will make a product. You can think about a chart. You can think about writing a summary to show what distinguishes those 5 different selections. Now, one of the points is a kid saying, why does he get to do that and I don't? Because we have some rules in our class. One of the rules is, in this class, equal opportunity is not the same as everyone being, it's not the same as equal tasks, sorry. And we've talked a lot about this. Everyone gets an opportunity to read. Everyone gets an opportunity to find out about genre. We all don't have to do it in the same way. So another way I can talk about it is multiple means to the same end. I'm holding Karen responsible to learn about genre. Debbie's responsible to learn about genre. Rhoda's responsible to learn about genre, but they're all not responsible to learn it in the same way. And this is a good example. I'm going to introduce it together, and then we're going to work in different configurations, some independently and some in a group. I have not had our kids say, why me? Because we've been very clear that in this class, equal opportunity is not everyone doing the same task at the same time. So I don't mean that it's not an equal task. We're just not doing it all the same way. In this classroom, one of the things that we believe is the idea that regardless of anything else, we believe in individual differences. And you have a right to be someone who differs, just as I have a right to be a teacher a little bit different than the one next door, or the one that you go to for the next period if you're in middle school. So that sets the scene. Now, would I do this for every single kid? No, I can't. I can't, and I would never tell you to do that. But as I look at the lessons I'm going to be teaching, what I can start to do is look at least hitting 3 or 4 kids in terms of their individual needs. I can't do it all the time. I would never expect that of myself. I can't do it for my, graduate students. But where I can, I will try to make that kind of amendment. So let me give you another example. In the lesson that we're learning about the idea of the American Revolution, which I talk about a lot because I taught 5th grade and thought it was fabulous. One of the things I'm looking at is the kid, let's just take the fear of failure. When I am planning this lesson, and there's more than just one, come on, there's never just one kid. But when I'm planning this lesson, one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to think about, this would be a really good way to have the kids work in a small group. And I'm going to look at the developmental readiness. This might be a really good way to keep reinforcing how to apply the information in some way. So I just have some choices that I'm trying to work against. One of my real goals would be that at some point our kids could get involved in individualizing for themselves. That would be what I would really love. We have not gotten there yet, but we're trying to make inroads to that. So let me show you one other thing. I'm watching the clock that we are doing, because I want to leave you some time for questions, et cetera, and other comments. This is our differentiation and diversity chart. And again, I will send copies of this, okay? So please don't write anything down. Well, you can write something down. Okay. But you can see here's what acceleration is. Here's some of the prompts of depth. Here are some of the prompts of complexity. And here's some of the areas of novelty. Can I just talk a little bit about some of the things I didn't talk about at the beginning? So I mentioned universal concepts such as power and change and systems. We talked about thinking like a disciplinarian, which is really the idea of immersing oneself in the discipline. One of the best books out on thinking like a disciplinarian is called Multiple Menu by Joe Renzulli. Talks about immersing kids in the disciplines. We talk about questioning, understanding the difference between an open question and a closed question, and the work by Richard Hyman, different kinds of questions, the difference between a factual question that has only one answer, an analytic question that is a comparative analysis question, and a evaluative question which asks for your own point of view. So, factual question, what's the date today? An analytic question, how would you compare Saturday to Sunday? An evaluative question, which day of the week do you love the most? We talk about concept building and bridges. How does this idea here about plants and their branches relate to this idea here about the government and its branches? Okay, conceptual building, bridging. These are some of the prompts of depth and complexity. So being able to understand patterns, the patterns of clouds, the patterns in science, the patterns of numbers. You should look at odd and even, the patterns of behaviors as you look at characters in a story. We look at things, for example, like context. What's the context? How does the context shape the situation? Why wasn't there a drought 2 years before? Why now? What does it have to do with all kinds of elements? And then you're looking here at novelty, and one of the things I wanted to focus on in novelty is the idea of independent study, the idea of developing intellectuals, the idea of problem solving, which we talked about, and kids becoming self-accountable. If you're bored, it's not my fault. What do you need to do to excite your own intellect? Sorry. And we're starting at young kids. I don't want to do this. I've already done Legos. This is, a 4-year-old. Then what do you need to do to make this more interesting? Because this is all we're going to give you right now is Legos. Oh, I think I'll build a boat instead of a tower. Oh, good idea. It doesn't take a lot. Okay, now I'm going to take, and I am going to pull this out. And here are some of the students of diversity, and so here are some of the alternatives. I can adjust time. I can have the kids do self-selected group membership. I can have the kids look at choices for alternative tasks and resources. I can have them work in a teacher group, a directed group. I can have them be a mentor, which is different than being somebody else's teacher. We need to talk about that. I can have them become an independent learner. I can, these two are kind of the same. I can, over here are the kids of diversity. The one that's bored, the one that's arrogant, the one that is a dominant leader. Okay, this is what we're doing. I know, I tear a lot of paper, but we're trying to show the viability of things. So here we go. Are you impressed with the way I tear? I've had lots of years of experience. But kidding aside, let me show you what we're talking about. We're saying, okay, let's do planning. So we have 3 or 4 teachers working together, or I can work by myself, and I'm saying, okay, look, in our study of, I scratch my head, I think about this, in our study of the American Revolution, one of the things that we're really going to do is we're going to look at the patterns of a revolution. And we're also going to have kids look at the concept of revolution, more than just the idea of the revolution like the tires on my car. So I need to be really, really aware of what I'm going to do for the curious learner and the kid that's really arrogant. Okay? I then am going to take my choices over here, and I am going to look at what they might be. And I have a handful of those. And one of the things that I am going to do is looking at the arrogant learner and the curious learner, looking at the fact that they are going to be using a universal concept and the idea that they're looking for patterns. I think that would be really, really interesting to both adjust the time and to have them work independently. Okay, it's not a foolproof method, but what we're trying to do is to change our thinking, to really look at what is it we can do to start to really see some individuality or individualization, or the idea of what we're calling, the recognition of diversity amongst our gifted kids by looking at what is differentiation and what can we do. And there's another way that we can do this, which is even kind of more interesting to some of our teachers, and that is a layered approach. So we could do it this way. What's the standard? The standard says that students will be able to pose and defend an argument related to an event in history or the plot of a story. Okay, so this is an anchor standard, Common Core anchor standard. All right, I know what I have to teach. There's no argument here. I need to look at the fact that I need to figure it out and start to think about how I'm going to differentiate it. So I'm going to differentiate it by thinking about this in terms of reasoning logically. I want to teach kids that to pose and defend an argument, you need to know if, then, because. And so I could really even use that learning strip, but that's what I'm going to do. And they're going to do this in terms of looking at the plot of a story. We are reading Johnny Tremain. All right, now I've got to think about this. Who am I really more concerned about? I'm really concerned about the English language learner. I am really, really concerned about the student who lacks some background knowledge. Maybe the kid who is, really in a situation where the cultural values are not really supporting the idea of being able to pose and defend an argument. Okay, how am I going to do this? One of the things I think we need to really do is really think about the idea of providing some choices for alternatives. Okay? I'm sorry, providing some choices for alternative tasks and some resources. So here's the thing that I need to do, and here's something I need to do too. I can really do with both of these, and I've laid out my pattern. So what I've tried to do is to think about the fluidity. That's why I tear up the pieces. I don't want to be lockstepped. I want to have it fluid so that I can mix and match. And incidentally, one of the things I was thinking about is the kid who is really hesitant might be really good in this as well. That might help. And it might be that when I really am providing for this some choices, that one of the things that I need to really think about is maybe the kids would like to be part of a self-selected group to work together. Now, that's how I'm trying to figure out how can I really forge ahead on the diversity that is within that group called the gifted, and still hold to the idea of teaching the core and also going through the process of looking at how I can emphasize the elements of differentiation, which in this case is novelty, which is also part of the core, which is the Common Core standard, attend to some of the needs of kids of diversity in some way. Okay, comments, questions, other points of view? Oh, come on. I know it's late, but please, thank you.
So you have this group, and what do you do if they don't move off step one?
If they don't move on,
Yeah, they don't do anything, they don't get going, what you step in with what you do?
it's a good question. I think one of the things they do is that you lose the chance to have an individualized experience for a while. That's it. I mean, it's really very, very clear. In other words, I learned this, I think, I watch a lot of classrooms when I go in and out, and I think some of the teachers I admire the most are the ones that are clear. I'm going to give you this opportunity. If you abuse this opportunity, I have the right then. So this is a time when you are going to be working, in this small group, and that is given to you so that we can help you satisfy your needs. But in this classroom, when you abuse that, then I take over. I can't stop and constantly help them. So the other thing I need to do is I need to help the kids understand when the time is that they can get some teacher assistance. Now, I'm still in the classroom. I'm not abandoning anybody, but I can't hover over them. And I want, there's several things I need to say to you. This whole thing about getting college ready? You guys, it's more than passing an AP class. It's more than getting high scores on the SAT or all A's. It's learning how to understand who you are and what you need to be successful. The attrition rate of gifted kids from different economic and different linguistic and different academic kinds of needs is terrible. Getting them to college is not the only issue. Having them stay there is it. So I've got to start early in teaching them some of the issues of becoming independent and making some choices. I was working with a group of freshmen a couple years ago, and one of the kids said to the other, and you've had this experience, gee, Willikers, it took me, 3 hours to read the chapter. 3 hours to read the chapter? I only read it, I read it in like 45 minutes. And the kid said, I admit it, we're not alike. I've got things that I need to do, you got things that you need to do. This is not a race. And I thought, good for him. That you understand who you are. So I said to him, where did you learn that? He said, I learned it from a teacher that tried very hard to help us understand. So I know it's not the perfect answer. Your question is a very good one. I wish there were more I could give you on that. Other questions or comments? Are you my reluctant learners? No. Yes, please.
What about taking the kid out of their comfort zone? Kind of pushing them.
Oh, good point. That's an excellent point. I've never thought about that. Tell us more about that.
Out of my comfort zone. Like a kid that's a reluctant learner.
Yeah.
Making them the leader.
Yeah. That's very, very interesting.
Something small, that's the main
Yeah.
project. Something small, they start to feel successful.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that we need to look at the difference between, you're absolutely right. Thank you so much. I think there's a difference between catering to and helping kids create another way of being. Absolutely, positively. So I think the point that you bring up is, at what point do we say, now you're going to try this? Excellent point. Excellent point. I think, too, there's something that Jim Gallagher talked a lot about, and I think I mentioned this, the difference between academic comfort and academic discomfort. And maybe one of the things I need to add to the mix here is, when is it appropriate that I can help you feel comfortable so that you can be successful? And when do we move you a little bit on the continuum so that little bit of discomfort becomes a motivational force and not a destructive force? It's an excellent point. Thank you for bringing that up. I really appreciate that. Really good point. Other comments, questions? Please.
I'm dealing with this issue right now with academic discomfort. But do you have any suggestions? Because I'm struggling to figure out, like, is it academic discomfort or is it not enough scaffolding? And you were kind of saying there's, because so many kids just want the answer. We want to answer the question, like, we don't want to go further than that. Like, when do you know the difference?
Yeah, can I give you just a short story? I promise I'll answer. I was fortunate enough to be in Russia watching some gifted classes, and this was in Moscow, where at the time there was a phenomenal gifted program. The kids were sitting there, these were fourth graders, and they all speak Russian, of course, and they were learning English. Many of them did not speak English very fluently. And they were looking at doing a comparative analysis between Tolstoy's story, which I'm sorry I don't remember, and looking at excerpts from Jack London's Call of the Wild. And I'm standing there and I thought, oh my gosh, you know, that was really a very sophisticated kind of experience. And I said to Natasha, who was the coordinator of gifted programs, I said, you know, this is very sophisticated. And she said, yes. And I said, well, don't you think that that's really more sophisticated than, you know, their age range? And she said, no. And she said something that I'm going to share. She said that what you haven't seen is the readiness for the challenge. And I thought a lot about that. I'm not sure that I do enough to really get the kids ready for the challenge. So that in that case, I'm wondering how much discomfort I am creating without that readiness. So that's one issue. The other issue is that even in my relationships with my own students, I'm not sure I spend enough time trying to figure out what it is that's actually going on in the learning situation. And what kind of questions might be really helpful to discern to what degree, you know, this is something that the task is promoting, this discomfort, something I'm promoting by not being clear enough, or something that, you know, really is on their part, and how we can kind of organize that. So I don't know if that's what you're looking for. But, you know, it's really interesting. There's many people who I've seen who are teachers who I really, really admire tremendously. And I'm sorry, one of the things that Fred used to do in his classroom, which I thought was really very interesting, and he said, you know, here's the task, okay? So it doesn't make any difference. Here's the task, okay? And you need to look at the fact that there's two variables to this task. One variable is the variable of interest, and the one variable is the variable of effort. And you need to kind of look, I talked a little bit about this yesterday, but you need to kind of look at, you know, the relationship between the two. If you only want to put in a little bit of effort for that task, then you need to look at what the consequences are. If you say, I'm not really interested, you need to look at the consequences. You're in charge of this, and you need to kind of look at that. I will do what I can to help you become more interested. I will do what I can to help you go through obstacles. But basically, it's the relationship between effort and interest that you need to think about so that you can at least talk to me about what you think you need. So,
Give them a way of like verbalizing what their discomfort is.
right,
Okay.
right. And you know, you have to also look at things like, well, I don't like the pencil. Well, I'm sorry, we can change that. Well, I don't think it's important to learn how to do this. That I can't change. So my job is to help you understand its value, but you know, we don't simply back out of the task. I can help you become more comfortable in the task. Thank you for asking. It's an important issue. Other questions or comments? So one of the things I just want to end with is the idea that, in all honesty, I can't do this all the time for every kid. That would be a lie, and I won't tell lies. But what we've done with our teachers is to help them become more aware that the group of gifted kids have as much diversity in that group as there is in any other group. And we get comments such as, I don't think this kid is really gifted. Why don't you think this kid is really gifted? I have the data. No, because he's not interested in working. Wait a minute. That is not one of the prerequisites for being identified as gifted. So I don't want to do indictment, I want to do an education. And so part of what we've been able to do, although we have no solution to all the problems, is at least become more aware and help the kids become more aware that we recognize them as individuals and not just as a group of kids called gifted. that there's as much variability amongst them as there is in any group. And that we can have, and this is an issue, in our AP classes, our honors classes, our cluster classes, our seminar classes, kids who don't want to be there because it's too hard, as they perceive it, or kids that really don't know how to study because they've never been taught. That's been another issue. That many of us, people think that because you're gifted, you know how to study. Doesn't mean that at all. I know gifted kids that are just lucky enough to confront the task that has been easy enough or, familiar enough for them to be successful. But their study habits are really very, very poorly defined and have never been really well developed because they've gotten by, so to speak. So even if this is not perfect in terms of the things I've shown you, at least I hope in the times that we've spent together that at least we brought to the awareness that there are kids that have these diverse needs and that we have some responsibility to help them recognize their responsibility for these needs as well as we as educators. So I thank you for the time that you've spent with us. I hope it has some productivity to you. And we will send you these forms or these pieces of paper that have information on them and hope that they'll have some use for you. So thank you very much.